Oh, you're there now. Okay, good. It's all my fault, always.
All right, well, let's go ahead and get started. Thank you everyone for taking a little bit of time out to start with this. I'm going to turn the floor over to Tom now that we've got him back on the line, just for any kind of opening remarks that he may have or comments from the division. So Tom, floor is yours.
Oh, thank you, Will. I just wanted to say hello to everybody. Working with Don Zinner and working on the opening up basically of the C schools. Hopefully we're going to start seeing some activity that way in first quarter of calendar year 21. There'll be more information coming out to everybody on that, but just keep doing the great work you're doing with Auxiliary, and we appreciate everything that everybody does every day. So take it away, Will.
Okay, thanks, Tom. Bruce, did we get you back online yet?
I just sent him the link. He should be back on directly.
Okay. So again, just a couple of housekeeping notes if you haven't heard it already. If you're not speaking, please put your audio panel on mute just to keep the background noise down. There's 3 distinct sections to the program, and so we're going to try to hold the questions until the end of each section. You'll know you're at that section because there'll be a picture of the cutter eagle, or the bark eagle, kind of marking the end of that section. So if you haven't done so already, please sign into the chat room with your name and member number. We'll use that transcript to get all of the registration for everybody's participation in this meeting. We are recording it, and if you know someone that needs this training and they miss it, give us a couple of days, and Walter will make that video link available for all the recording. Did we get Bruce back yet?
Let's see. Just admitting him now, along with Dawn. And I think he's back. Bruce, are you with us?
Will, as a reminder, questions are to be typed into the chat room, addressed to everyone, and then I'll catch them at the end of each section, like you said, and pass them to Bruce for answering.
Okay.
Can you hear me, or Will?
Now we can.
Perfect. I'm back.
Okay, so Bruce, we've gone through introductions while we were waiting on you to get back in the room. So with no further ado, everyone, this is probably one of the newest members of the Auxiliary, and so very proud of him that he stepped up and helping us out with this training. So Bruce, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. You want to flip to the first slide?
Aviator.
Oh, that's right.
That's not it.
Yeah. Let's see if I thought I had it up here, but it will be here with us shortly.
No problem.
All right, let me go full screen. And okay, hopefully that's it.
There we go. That looks familiar. Thank you very much. Perfect. So, everybody up? Okay, welcome. Thanks for letting me provide an aeromedical brief on human factors in aviation. It's both a privilege and an honor to speak with those of you who volunteer to fly for the operational side of the Coast Guard Auxiliary and the Department of Homeland Security. And it's my hope we can explore some issues that are paramount importance to the safety and well-being of pilots and aircrew. I've taken the liberty to include several photos and personal pearls of wisdom related to my own experience, both as a pilot and a former naval flight surgeon. Next slide. Next slide. There we go. Brief introduction. Although I'm relatively new to the United States scope,
I think we just lost him. His video locked up and he went silent.
Yeah, I think we lost audio.
Hey, Bruce, I'll call him.
Nice picture, though.
Hey, Bruce, we lost your audio and your video is locked up. Oh, it just moved a little bit. I can see on the phone now. I don't think it does. Say something towards your computer and we'll see if we can hear it through the... Is anybody hearing Bruce?
I'm not.
Nope.
He's
No.
looks like he's muted. Tell him to check his mute button.
Negative.
Are you muted by any chance? Nobody's hearing you online. I can hear you over the phone, not through the computer.
Yeah.
how about that? Does that work?
Yes.
We're back on.
Okay, very good. I'm gonna hang up phone. Can you hear me now?
Yes,
Yep.
Perfect. Okay.
I'm here.
All right. My squadron skipper allowed me to transition. We went from the H-3 helicopter to the H-60 Seahawk, and he allowed me to transition with the pilots. And I was able to fly aboard 6 different aircraft carriers and flew as a co-pilot in multiple missions, including SAR, passenger transport, plane guard, and basically most missions that were non-weapons missions. Next slide. On the civilian side, after leaving active duty, I became a part owner in a Cessna XP and a Beach Bonanza that had air conditioning, which is pertinent to the first lecture. Both are wonderful planes, comfortable fly, and my wife loved them. Plenty of room for luggage. This photo was taken at the Naval Air Station Jacksonville Air Show on a beautiful hot day. And Jermaine did the brief on heat stress. Notice the smart people hiding under the wings and the shadows of the plane hiding from the sun. 2 years before, I offered to staff the medical clinic at the air show, fully expecting to sit around, drink a Coke, sit in a lawn chair and watch the air show. Instead, it was about a 98-degree day, no air, no clouds, and we had 20 to 30 people lying all over the floor. We had ice bags in the armpits. We had ice bags in the neck. Some people even started ice cold IV fluid, and we only had to admit one to the hospital. Unfortunately, that one was a pregnant female who did deliver that day. Next slide. Anybody know this location? It's Cedar Key, Florida. And 4 things I like about this picture that I find remarkable. It was the only time my wife ever flew with me in formation. It was the last time my wife ever flew with me in formation. And 2 lessons I learned about marriage and airplanes. One of them is always know where the off switch to the ICS is. And the second one is it's not a smart idea to take a luggage compartment out to put a smoke system in. And she reminded me how really, really hot and miserable it got in that plane simmering in the Florida summer heat, which leads me to the brief. Next picture. Next slide. Okay, so the brief is going to be on human factors in aviation. Heat stress and dehydration is the first part, fatigue and sleep deprivation, and then the last is age, alcohol, and medication. And I need to give special thanks to one of my friends, a flight surgeon for NASA, who donated a few slides to me. And also I went over to the Naval Aviation Physiology Department up the road in NAS Jacksonville, and Lieutenant Aaron Bishop also gave me a few slides and information, and that was at the Naval Survival Training Center. Next slide. From the FAA's perspective, looking back from the birth of aviation in 1903, when man was more reliable than machine, over time, the total number of accidents decreased significantly. Unfortunately, with the complexities of aviation, the relative percentage of those accidents are now caused by human factors, not mechanical. Next slide. Okay, so why does the United States Coast Guard and the United States Navy mandate aeromedical lectures? Obviously because of safety. And if you notice, this is numbers of aircraft accidents on the left. So it's number of mishaps per 100,000 flight hours on the vertical axis, and the horizontal axis as years from 1981 to 1998. And both mechanical and human factors are going down, but still human factors are about 80% of naval aircraft accidents. And I'm gonna use a lot of Navy slides being ex-Navy, and believe it or not, and I think that's fair game, since with a stroke of a pen, the Coast Guard can become part of the Navy as well at any day. Next slide. From the Coast Guard Auxiliary's perspective, they state that human error, they said it's in 1993, the study they used said that 60 to 65%, so 2/3 of mishaps occurred due to human error. They broke it down differently. They said about 90% were due to poor judgment, inattentiveness, and ineffective supervision. Next slide. Anybody take a guess at the cause of this? Well, let's just say it's human factors. There's a high probability it's human factors, and it's probably landing mishap. The flaps are down. And this poor guy's hanging by the wheel struts upside down in high voltage wires with fuel tanks full. FAA 99G006 at the bottom is actually the FAA Human Factors Analysis and Classification System code. Okay. This photograph from the FAA is a general aviation accident. And in the summer, an Air Sunshine small charter company out of the Bahamas had a mechanical failure. And if you notice the blown rear cylinder on the right engine, you also notice the pilot did the right things. The prop was feathered, the left was still turning. As you can see, the blades are bent, flaps are partially down, and fortunately the plane remained upright. The pilot did an excellent job on the emergency landing, and all passengers walked away. I guess I should say swam away to be correct, with no significant injury. Human factors, though, the question comes up, was the plane fully loaded on departure? Was the density altitude correct for a hot summer's day? And anyway, next slide. During the lecture, I'm going to use a search engine called PubMed, and that's medical publications backwards, and it's .gov, not .com. And it's an excellent search engine. It's free by the government. And if you wish to fact check your spouse, friends, or when they refer to Dr. Oz's latest herbal cure for baldness, or the saleswoman with a nose ring in the neighborhood told you how to cure aging, don't use Google, or don't use, because it's full of garbage, trash advertisements. Use this. And it pulls up nice abstracts. And we're going to look at a bunch of them when I did the search for this lecture. That are short, easy to read, and it gives you the facts, not fiction. Next slide. Okay. Will suggested several excellent topics, and so I narrowed them down to heat stress, fatigue, sleep deprivation, alcohol, age, and medications. And next slide. Okay. Environmental factors affecting aircrew health. And If you look at this slide, do you know what kind of plane this is? It looks like the perfect plane for thermal stress. It's a MiG-21.
MiG-21.
Right. And okay, the next question. Anybody know the markings?
Egyptian.
Very close. It's Indian markings. It's the Indian Air Force. And the Indian Air Force is the only Air Force to ever shoot down an F-16. And it probably isn't a testament to the MiG-21 as much as it is to the R-73 Archer missile they use. And, you can see this picture looking at the canopy, the desert, the fire around the pilot, and sitting around a jet engine. It's a very hot environment. Next slide. So we're going to go over factors causing heat stress, the effects of heat stress, factors with heat tolerance, heat strain, how to get rid of heat stress, and Lulu will conclude this part. Next slide. So the cause of heat stress, heat production relative to heat elimination, and there are multiple factors. Next slide. Looking at the factors causing heat stress. Next slide. So multiple factors, and think of that MiG-21 flying over the desert. First look at the design of your aircraft. Is it a high wing, low wing, single engine, multi-engine, bubble canopy, etc. And if you look at the little picture in there, the cockpit heat sources, you have radiant heat from the sun, convective heat going through the canopy. The pilot produces metabolic heat. Aerodynamic heat is the friction on the plane. The electrical equipment, fortunately with some of the newer glass cockpits, the internal heat is decreased. And those of you flying single engine aircraft, the engine heat and exhaust itself are factors because they go right around the pilot. Next slide. On a personal level, the last plane I owned was this fully aerobatic Russian Yak-52 military trainer, and it was similar in purpose to a T-34 Mentor. But unlike the Bonanza I owned that had an air conditioner, the Yakolov Bureau designed the plane to be flown in Siberia, not in Florida. Just imagine the summer greenhouse effect when you sit under a plexiglass canopy with a Nomex flight suit, the top black asphalt, high noon, and the slipstream of air. If you notice the arrows there, the louvers, the air would flow over the radial engine and heat up the air, and then it comes out where the red air is. And if you're not moving through the air and you're sitting on the pavement, all that heat goes right up in the canopy. So it was a very, very hot aircraft to fly in Florida. Probably great if you lived in Siberia. Next slide. If you're curious about a Yak, this is what it looks like inside, since I'm talking to a lot of pilots. One reason I put this slide up here is if you look at the red arrow, I had it parked out on the tarmac, and the heat cracked, made that crack right there. And again, the plane wasn't designed for Florida. And this is also the same layout. It's pretty stressful to fly at first. The fuel's in liters. That is the attitude indicator. That's how it looks when you're flying straight and level with the ground on top and the sky underneath. And that's the way the Soviets and the Communist Chinese Party have it. FAA required the altimeter to be in feet instead of meters. VSI was still in meters. And it's a handbrake. So if you notice the stick, it has a handbrake. And that's also the differential steering for the plane. Next slide. Okay, climate factors. Air temperature. And again, I want you to think of District 7, Florida, South Georgia, South Carolina as well. You got it all. You got hot air temperature, high humidity, sometimes days when there's no air movement, and the radiant heat from the sun, and on the body sitting in a green flight suit. Next slide. Factors causing heat stress. Well, metabolic heat, that's the heat you produce from your basal metabolic rate. And acclimatization means just going from air conditioning to non-air conditioning. But what I want to focus on is the flight clothing. In multiple layers, it causes an interference with evaporation and non-evaporative heat exchange, which would be the wind in the air. Next slide. If we look at G.I. Joe Aviator, you'll see that you wear most of this stuff when you're out looking on SAR. You don't have a helmet, but you're probably wearing a headset. You have survival gear. You're wearing a Nomex suit, convex boot, Nomex gloves, and harnesses. So there's a lot of things to keep heat inside the body. Next slide. And try to put a few of my own pictures in here. My wife actually wanted me to take this picture out because she said, you don't even look like that anymore. You don't have dark hair. You have gray hair, a bald spot, and you weigh about 10 pounds more. But I put it back in here anyway. The two era, and by the way, this is in Fallon, Nevada, high noon, in the middle of the summer. And the heat would get over 100 degrees. And inside the F-14, you're surrounded by, in the back of the F-14, I didn't fly, I sat in the back of that one. You're surrounded by all kinds of electrical equipment. And the top arrow is a sweat rag I have attached to the D harness just to wet the sweat off my face when I was flying. And the bottom is where the sweat line was on the G suit going up from the bottom. So that's the line where the sweat started and stopped. So I can personally talk about heat stress as well. Next slide. For those of you that are fortunate in your plane to have an air conditioning system, good for you. The Beach Bonanza I was a part owner in had one. The H3 in the Navy did not. The H60 Seahawk did have one, and the Yak definitely did not have one. So the good news about an air conditioning is that it's great to have it. The bad news is there's cabin noise, extra heat, cold spots, you name it. Next slide. Okay, effects of heat stress in aviators. So next slide. Looking at what heat does to you, you have to break it down to two different components. Is there a question? All right, two different components. You've got the psychomotor, which is memory. It affects your memory, it affects your attention, reaction time, and manual dexterity in your hands. And physiological parameters, you're going to increase sweating, which causes more dehydration, and reduced G tolerance. You say, well, what does that have to do with general aviation? Next slide. Believe it or not, and I found this in the literature and I was kind of surprised, does a Coast Guard auxiliary pilot really need to be concerned with the G-lock? And I've lost a friend with the G-lock. And if they're flying a mission in Georgia on a VFR day and it's really, really hot. Next slide. Okay, so this is one of the article abstracts that pop up when you enter data into PubMed. And this is from military medicine. And this was a H-60 helicopter on a hot day with high humidity, and he did a 2.5 degree turn. And you'll hit, if you pulled a 60 degree turn, you're gonna pull 2 Gs. And if you pull up a little bit, you could easily get 2.5 Gs. He lost vision, which is an early sign of G-lock. So he reported it and they documented it. So it is possible in a general aviation aircraft to have G-lock if you also have high temperature, high humidity, and you're dehydrated. Next slide. Now, if you remember when you were in school, there was heat stress, heat exhaustion, heat stroke. What's the difference? How do you tell them apart? Okay, next slide. Well, obviously, most pilots don't carry a rectal thermometer in their flight bag. I hope not. So heat stress. Signs and symptoms of heat stress. You should think of mental ability, performance, quick decisions, alertness, visual capabilities, and causation and caring, attitude. So these are the first things you're going to see in early heat stress. If you did have a rectal thermometer in your flight bag, and I hope you don't, you'd have a temperature about 99.5 to maybe 100 degrees Fahrenheit. Next slide. Judgment is one of those things to go. Anybody notice anything abnormal here? A little lack of judgment on the pre-flight of this aircraft, or the pilot needed glasses, one or the other. Next slide. The next level is heat exhaustion. That's 101 to 105 degrees Fahrenheit. You should be thinking about landing and calling ahead if you see the pilot or aircrew nausea, vomiting, which could be air sickness, but keep in mind it can also be heat exhaustion, fatigue, cramps. These are physical signs, rapid breathing, or passing out. Next slide. definitely some heat stress going on here. And by the way, the man is climbing out of the aircraft, and you know what he's stepping on? It's not the wheel, it's the auxiliary fuel tank.
Fuel tank.
Yeah, had a good day. Next slide. And the last thing you're going to run into is heat stroke, and that's when your temperature gets above 105. And I've seen this a few times, and it's scary because you're on the road to death. Body's heat mechanism shuts down. Confused, disoriented, you don't know what's going on. You will eventually lapse into a coma and die. Next slide. I took this picture when we took a trip to Mount Vesuvius on a tour of Pompeii, Italy, a few years ago. And contrary to the movies, the residents in Pompeii actually had plenty of warning to escape the eruption of Pompeii. So this poor soul went through all the stages of heat stress very fast because he didn't pay attention to the symptoms early. And just as a side note, all these plaster casts still had the bones inside and shoes on and things like that they found, although the skin had degraded. They found holes when they were excavating, they poured plaster in it, and that's what came out. So pretty spooky, but that is all the stages of heat stress, stroke, rolled into one. Next slide. What factors affect heat tolerance? Next slide. If you want to stay healthy, wealthy, and wise, try to negate these negative factors. So most, if not all, these human factors are controllable with proper planning, exercise, hydration, and willpower. So obesity, a lack of physical fitness, fatigue, lack of sleep, dehydration, fever, and illness, lack of acclimatization. So as a doctor, I said it all, I feel good, it's all done. Next slide. Although I don't do it myself all the time. Okay, heat strain parameters in industries. How do you measure whether you're going to be prone to heat stress or not? What other than just a thermometer on the outside? Next slide. When I was with an air wing on active duty, this is an F-14 that was with the Red Rippers, one of my squadrons. And during the Iran-Iraq War, they were required to keep a plane. There were no planes flying. They were required to keep a plane in the steam catapult, and the pilots would sit there with the canopy open. And it was like being in a sauna in 100-degree temperature, and the wind was blocked by the plane, and steam was rolling up on either side. We had a couple of pilots in Rios that got heat stress. We had to go out every day in the afternoon and check with wet bulb globe temperature. Next slide. And what you're looking for, and if you want to know what this is, whenever you listen to the TV or the weatherman and they go, this is the feel-like temperature, that's what they're talking about. And obviously the danger zones are anything above 100 degrees. Even if it's not, high 90s, you can easily run into these scenarios in District 7, flying in District 7 or District.
3,000 followers for Nashville right now. 3,000.
Okay, next slide. This is what the device looks like today. They don't use charts anymore. They go outside. Part of this thing has wet and humid, and they swing it around, and it does a calculation to tell you what the feel-like temperature is. Obviously, in a hot, humid day with very little wind, you're going to get a very high number. Next slide. And it uses air temperature, humidity, wind speed, sun angle, sun radiation. How to alleviate thermal stress in aviators. Next slide. Okay, certain areas, let's look at station policies, pre-flight solution, in-flight solution, and personal cooling systems. Next slide. It's not always possible, but better planning of sorties, rotation of aircrew for sorties, adequate interval between sorties, and obviously if you're really hot, they don't want you to go right back out again, they want you to cool off, and wet bulb globe temperature checks at the weather station. So making sure they're less than 100. Next slide. At the station itself, and again, I understand a lot of times these aren't possible, but the ergonomics and design of the flying station, does air circulate through it? Air-conditioned building for your brief. Maybe you go out and pre-flight the plane, go back, have your brief, and then go out. Use of mobile cold air units. And they're not all military. The civilian have, there's one version of it for civilians you can carry with you. And if you have a small fan inside, that helps. Next slide. Balance and diet before the sorties. Well, I'm as guilty as anybody else. If I'm hungry and I don't have much time, I don't go out and grab a really good meal. But sometimes I'll grab a power bar, drink some fluid, and then go back out and fly. So next slide. Are power bars helpful to help stay awake, especially if they have caffeine for a boost of energy? Next slide. This power bar came right out of the NAS JAX exchange. And if you didn't pay any attention, look, a lot of gobbledygook on the back, you go, good, give me a little boost of energy and go. Next slide. But when you read the details, vitamin C, 417%, vitamin B12, 588%. And here's the scary part. It says in the middle under important disclosure, this product may contain legal dietary ingredients that are prohibited by sports and or cause false positive for banned prescribed substances due to the unique restrictions of amateur professional sports organization, the armed forces, law enforcement, and other agencies. So be careful what you eat. And this is in the exchange. Next slide. Use of efficient cabin conditioning systems. Next slide. For those of you that don't want to spend $2,500 or more for an air conditioning system, apparently, and maybe you've seen some of these, I did see one on a friend of mine's aircraft. You fill these things up with ice. They have a fan and a radiator system. So the radiator system is cooled by the ice cubes and it blows cool air in the aircraft. You can even put it in the aircraft, cool off your aircraft before you take off. Like you pre-flight, put it in, cool off, pump out the water to decrease the weight, and then take off with it or take it back inside. But they're about $500. Next slide. Tips for staying hydrated while flying. That's water. That's not a vodka tonic. Next slide. And here's some things from the FAA. And some of these are common sense, some of them aren't. Drink cool water, carry a container with you. Don't rely on the thirst sensation. We'll talk about that as an alarm. Limit your daily intake of caffeine and alcohol. Both are diuretics. We'll talk about that a little bit. Exercise can cause a large amount of fluid, so don't go work out just before you fly. Acclimatization and personal effects of aging, recent illness, fever, and in heat and conditions. Salt and electrolyte loss is a factor, but not for the average person. That is spot on. So a lot of the stuff about the Gatorade is, we'll talk about it. Next slide. So what happens with mild hypohydration? That means slightly, before you're really dehydrated, just a little dehydrated. Your exercise performance decreases, your mental function decreases, your mood may decrease, fatigue goes up, glucose regulation goes down, the blood vessels kind of slow down, so that means you're more prone to G loss. Thermal regulation may or may not work very well, and cerebral blood flow gets a little messed up. And orthostatic tolerance means you're more prone to pass out. Next slide. The key that you should be aware of is most folks become thirsty with about a quart and a half deficit or 2%. Some people at 1%. This mechanism should trigger the thirst mechanism. You know, you're thirsty, you drink. A problem is that sometimes it arrives too late, especially in older individuals. And a small amount of fluid in the mouth actually turns the mechanism off. So you shut down the thirst drive and you get more dehydrated. So if you're gonna take a sip of water, take a lot of water. Don't just take a sip. Next slide. The next slide basically says the elderly have a higher thirst threshold and it can cause symptoms of dehydration. So be aware that you can't trust your thirst as much. And we'll talk about how much fluid you need in a flight in a minute. Next slide. Does mild dehydration affect your cognitive function? So next slide. This is a study in military medicine on the effects of hydration on cognitive function in pilots. And they showed definitively that flight performance and spatial cognition tests were significantly poor for pilots who had low fluid intake and experienced dehydration in comparison to those pilots that were well hydrated. Next slide. What percentage of military missions actually result in fluid loss? Next slide. And I really like this study because it mirrors the amount of dehydration you'd realistically expect flying a SAR flight in the summer. This study, they took 48 Israeli Air Force pilots, some jet, half Black Hawk pilots that volunteered for the study. And what they found is 11% experienced a significant, more than 1% loss in body weight, or equal to about a liter in 2 hours. Black Hawk pilots lost the most, 500 cc's an hour, which is 2 cups an hour. And jet pilots lost a little bit more, but they were very short missions. Probably the reason they lost more is the oxygen is 0 humidity. So a lot of that was for exhale humidity. But 11% showed significant dehydration, and the mean loss was 462 cc's an hour. Next slide. Is it really, you hear Gatorade commercials. Is it really better to consume electrolyte solutions like Gatorade than just water when you're dehydrated? Next slide. Sodium is bad, so that's a given. And the arrows are kind of where I'm pointing to the slide. You don't have to read through the whole thing, please don't. And this study was actually funded by one of the Gatorade kind of companies that makes electrolyte solution. And they found that older adults retain beverages with less sodium compared with other adults. And the amino acid, you know, that's protein and carbohydrate-based solutions had a little bit extra retention. So maybe yes, maybe no. Next slide. Now, Gatorade and those things have glucose in them, and that's always a concern. So should you drink Gatorade with glucose? You say, I get some energy. Really? No. There's really no difference in water and electrolyte solutions for flying, or, you know, some mild dehydrations. But Gatorade electrolyte solutions actually increase sweat loss. So it's not better than water. So if you drink Gatorade, you're going to sweat more. Next slide. So basically it says the same thing for exercise. Electrolyte supplementation is not warranted. So there is no benefit to Pedialyte electrolytes. If you're going, water is just as good as anything else. Next slide. So what about caffeine containing beverages? Is any really disadvantage to hydrating with a beverage with like tea or coffee that have caffeine? Well, next slide. If you weigh the benefits of caffeine ingestion and dehydration versus fatigue, it probably really doesn't matter much. So if you've got a beverage you want to drink with a little caffeine, go ahead and do it. It says caffeine increased urine flow and sweat electrolyte secretion. I think urine flow is 28% increase, but it says these effects are not enough to affect dehydration or blood electrolyte levels for about 120 minutes in a hot environment. So no, don't worry about caffeine. I know it may make you sweat a lot and it may cause you a little bit of extra urine. I think that was about 11%, but it doesn't really matter that much. So that was a myth. So if you want to drink something with caffeine or tea, go ahead. Next slide. So in conclusion, next slide. Heat stress can't be eliminated. It's just part of life, especially in the Southeast. It's still a problem in military flying. Simple precautionary measures will reduce heat strain to an acceptable level. Proper thermal control helps a long way in succession of the mission and enhances flight safety. Next slide. What does the Coast Guard actually say about it themselves? Next slide, if you zoom in. It says, very often, this describes Coast Guard auxiliary flights perfectly. Very often, auxiliary crews called on to fly long missions at low altitudes, 1,000 to 1,500 feet during the summer months. Possibility of dehydration during missions of this type is imperative that all crew members stay alert. And this is what they're holding you to and expect you to know. For the first signs of dehydration, the pilot in command always has the authority to halt a mission when it appears safety is becoming an issue, and never should there be any hesitation to do so. Be sure to carry water for all crew members. Stop to allow crew members to rehydrate. Cool off when you can. Rest is a good idea. Symptoms are loss of fluid through sweat, vomiting, urine, eyes that seem to shrink, dry mouth, loss of skin elasticity, absent urination, and no tearing in the eyes. Like that's going to be something easy to tell when you're flying. But go ahead, next slide. So you say, what's the big deal? So much for medical advice. I'll just drink water when I'm thirsty. And obviously, if you look on the exam table, that was a snowman that's melted. The results are back. You're just dehydrated. Next slide. And basically the reason that I put that in there is just be aware that by a sip or two of water, all you do is nullify the thirst mechanism and you're going to cut it off and you'll get more dehydrated. So if you're going to drink water, drink water. Don't just take a sip or two. Follow the station policy. Plan your sorties in cool hours of the day. If you can, plenty of fluid. Don't exert prior to the sorties. Don't go out and exercise. And try to have an adequate interval between the sorties. Next slide. Okay. This was not a statement about climate. This was just a statement about fashion. So stay cool, keep hydrated, and fly safe. Next slide. And that basically concludes the first part of the lecture. And you got to admit, isn't that a gorgeous picture? Kind of makes you glad you joined the Coast Guard Auxiliary. Any pertinent questions so far?
There have been no questions submitted so far, Bruce.
Okay, good. I'll move on to the next. And do you hear me okay?
Good to go.
Good.
Yeah,
Okay.
clear to go.
Next slide. Next. The next slide is really a big deal right now with the FAA, and it's been a big deal in the Navy for some time, and that's fatigue and sleep deprivation. Next slide. And so the first thing we want to talk about being asleep at the yoke, and this is from an article just recently published. Next slide. So FAA Safety Briefing publishes a magazine every couple of months, and this was from the July-August 2020 edition FAA Safety Briefing, and it featured the article of fatigue in general aviation, asleep at the yoke. Next slide. Inside the article, it makes this quote. You gotta think about this for a second. That after fatigue is not only a risk during the lull of cruise flight, it poses a risk basically during all stages of flight. And it said that after 17 hours without sleep, your ability to control, guide, and direct your hands closely resembles someone with a blood alcohol content of 0.5 to 0.8%. Next slide. You know who this is?
Lindy,
Yeah. You know what he's famous for?
sleeping.
Lindy.
Yeah, for this lecture, he's the poster child for fatigue, lack of sleep, and general aviation. If you thought he was the first guy to fly across the Atlantic, you'd be incorrect. First folks to fly across the Atlantic was Commander Albert Reed, United States Navy, in the Curtiss NC-4 seaplane, the Lame Duck. And he went from Newfoundland to Portugal. And it took him 3 weeks, 6 stops, and between the United States Coast Guard and the United States Navy supplied 53 ships staged along the route for navigational reference. And so you say, well, maybe he was the first guy to fly across the Atlantic nonstop. No. That goes to 2 former RAF pilots, John Alcock and Arthur Brown. And that was nearly a decade before Lindbergh. And they flew it in a reconfigured Vickers biplane, a World War I bomber converted. They took the bomb bay racks out and they put fuel tanks in. He flew from Newfoundland to Ireland in 16 hours. Unfortunately, he crash landed in an Irish bog, and it wasn't too widely publicized. A decade later, Lindbergh made his famous New York to Paris stop nonstop solo. So he was the first guy to do it solo. Next slide. And that plane was the Spirit of St. Louis. What wasn't known is that the flight took 33.5 hours. But what wasn't known is that he had no sleep the night before. So he went 21 hours without any sleep prior to the flight. And obviously, I'd be pretty nervous too if you thought this might be your very last flight. So he had over 55 hours without any sleep. And he described in his book he experienced hallucinations and spoke of mirages, like fog islands forming in the sea below when he looked. He went down to cool off in the sea because he started to get really confused. He spoke of apparitions floating weightless in the plane. Next slide. That's the video, so you can skip right by it. Okay. This is, most Navy flight surgeons know this slide, and this is the Y causal factors of mishaps and HAZREPs. And the Navy broke this down. If you look, they broke it down into all these different categories. The number one category, without a doubt, for aircraft mishaps is fatigue. The number one for fatalities is going to be spatial disorientation. We can talk about that another time if you want. If you look at the classifications over here, Class A are death or permanent disability. Class B is disability, and Class C is just loss of work. And there's also a monetary, for those of you that are ex-Navy, there's a monetary component that can be Class A, B, or C. And I've done 3 Class A mishaps in my career, and they're not pretty. They're going to change that because, as you noticed yesterday, the recent F-35 accident, each plane's $100 million, and they found out it's so easy to go from Class C to Class A, they're going to have to revamp the monetary criteria for each criteria. But anyway, fatigue is the number one causative factor, human factor for mishaps. Next slide. Looking at even if the more modern, they broke it down even to more categories, the Y causal factor, human factors of mishaps. And still, by far, the most common cause is fatigue. Next slide. Let's talk about sleep. A normal amount of sleep that folks should get is about 8 to 8.5 hours. True or false? Minimum 5 hours a night is what's required to maintain performance.
Nope.
Nope. That's right. Actually, the magic number is 7. So there's some genetic factor in how much sleep you need. For every 2 hours of performance, you need 1 hour of sleep. Higher mortality rates. In other words, if you sleep less than 6 hours a day, you're more likely to die. If you sleep more than 10 hours a day, you're more likely to die. My guess is that's from folks that are depressed. Sleep can't be banked, but sleep deficits do accumulate. Rest doesn't replace sleep, but it definitely helps by taking short naps. Next slide. So you're a pilot, and the air crew comes up to you in the morning. You're doing a SAR mission, and looks a little bit tired. And you say, "How are you doing?" He goes, "Sir, I'm good to go. I'm just a little tired." And you go, "Okay." There's probably some questions you should ask at that point. Next slide. What if the air crew came up to you and said, "Sir, I'm good to go. I'm just a little drunk"? Do you think anybody would let him fly? Hopefully not. But I'm going to go on and show you there's not much difference. Next slide. So we're going to see this slide in 2 different ways. So the graph on the left is relative performance decline with hours of wakefulness, i.e. no sleep. So if you look at the bottom, it's 10 hours, 12, 14, 16, 18, 20, 26 hours without sleep. And this is your decline in performance. The graph on the right is relative performance relative to the blood alcohol content. So the 2 arrows are 0.08, which is legally drunk, and then 0.04 is the other one. And the reason that's there is that is the limit for the FAA for flying. Now, I didn't say that's the limit for the Coast Guard Auxiliary under orders, but that's the if they check you, that is your limit. So it's half of what it is to be legally drunk driving a car to fly an airplane. Next slide. Should you take power naps? I mean, I've heard don't take a nap, but you're just going to be more tired. You won't get any rest. It's not a good idea. That's false. The answer is if you're really tired, you definitely should take a nap. And if you can get 60 to 90 minutes out of it, you're golden. Next slide. This is what sleep looks like to a sleep doctor. The REM sleep, which means rapid eye movement, is at the top. And that's when you're a little bit more awake, but you're still asleep. And then there's deep sleep, when you're deep asleep. To recharge your batteries, you actually need to go through both REM and deep sleep. And normally, it says ultradian cycles. A circadian rhythm is just when there's one sine wave over a day. An ultradian rhythm means there's multiple rhythms in a day. And normal sleep cycle has about 5-6 cycles of the circadian rhythm. If you can get from REM to deep back to REM, that you're going to get a lot out of it. So just be aware of that. If you just get one REM to deep sleep cycle, you're gonna benefit from that. We'll show you that in a second. Next slide. Power naps. Power naps, do they increase performance? Yes. Natural fatigue occurs normally in everybody from midnight to 6 in the morning, and then again from 2 o'clock to 1600 every day. So if you can take a nap, take a nap. Next slide. And I took this next picture at midnight. Took this next picture on a windjammer cruise in the French West Indies from the ship Zodiac, just as the sun was setting. So if that's just to kind of get you in the sleepy mood. Maybe I shouldn't do that while I'm giving a talk. Next slide. Now, just to prove to you that there's this midnight to 6 o'clock in the morning is a very dangerous window to be. If you look at the Exxon Valdez, that was at 15 minutes after midnight. Chernobyl occurred at 1:23 in the morning. I don't know about the Kuwait X-46 mishap. The Roosevelt Leyte Gulf is when the Leyte Gulf, which is out of Mayport, Florida, ran into the Roosevelt, which is a nuclear-powered Nimitz-class carrier. And if that went down, that would be pretty bad, having nuclear waste all over the ocean.
Wow.
3 Mile Island, and that was, 3 Mile Island was at 4 o'clock. So you can see that if you're doing a night flight, that is the most dangerous time for mishaps. Next slide. Now let's look at the value of sleep. This shows this is sleep deprivation on the bottom, and this is how much thought process. In other words, when your ability to function decreases from 0 to 120. This is showing that there's a definite, the further out you are from rest, the more benefit you get with a short nap. And this is only a 30-minute nap. Next slide. I want to stop for a minute and talk a little bit about this slide, because a few years ago, remember when the FAA made pilots retire at, well, anyway, I'll skip that for right now. But the FAA requires extra pilots on long-haul flights. Why? So if you, the chart on the left shows the number of errors prior to landing without a nap. And it shows 2 pilots in here, but I called a friend of mine who's a United Airline pilot and said, there may be retired airline pilots in this group I'm talking to, and can you tell me the rules and regs on when you need extra pilots? He goes, I can give it to you in a nutshell. He said, and if one of you guys is a retired airline guy, correct me, but he said on long haul flights from 8 to 12 hours, he said you need to carry an extra, 8 to 12 hours, you need an extra co-pilot. On flights of 12 to 16 hours, I think you need a captain and 2 flight officers. And greater than 16, he said you actually have to have 2 captains and 2 flight officers. And then he said there's a whole lot more to it and how much sleep you have to get. But if you look at the chart on the right, if one of the pilots said, hey, I'm going to go take a nap, gets relieved, and goes in a seat and takes a 40-minute nap, comes back to fly, look at the difference in the 2 charts and the number of errors made on an ILS approach. Just stop. So that's why the FAA requires more than 2 pilots for long flights to give and my airline pilot friend said, yeah, we call that getting paid to take a nap is a good deal. We call it dozing for dollars. Okay. So in a nutshell, naps are good. More naps are better. Long naps are best. And if you need to take a nap, take a nap. Power naps, 30 minutes are just great. 30 to 90 minutes are great. There's a next slide called the Walter Reed Army Institute of Research. And this is a big one with the military. WAIR, next slide. Next slide. Walter Reed Army Institute of Research is a well-funded Department of Defense project to study the effects and methods in dealing with fatigue. So they partnered with more than a dozen universities, the Office of the Surgeon General, the National Institute of Health, Naval Medical Research Unit, and with the United States Special Operations Command. Why? Next slide. Why are they investing so much money in research to study the impact of sleep deprivation and fatigue? Because anything that can give you an edge in today's technology, demanding military environment is absolutely essential to win a war and prevent the loss of lives. Now, if you look over to the right, you read with me the impact of lack of sleep. And it says more than 62% of soldiers are chronically sleep restricted, averaging less than 6 hours of sleep per night. We said the magic number 7. And then performance, 5 nights with less than 5 hours of sleep creates a 20% cognitive deficiency, the equivalent of 0.08 blood alcohol level. 5 nights with less than 5 hours. We talk about 17 hours. You can just, if you only get 5 hours a night of sleep, you function no better than someone who's legally drunk. Safety. During deployment, more than 33% of soldiers report falling asleep on duty, and more than 50% of accidents were caused by sleeplessness. 25% of all motor vehicle accidents, 25%, are due to sleep deprivation. Physical health, I'm going to save that for another slide. And then mental health, soldiers who average less than 5 hours of sleep every 24 hours are 4.7 times, 470% more likely to develop PTSD, and 11.4 times more likely to develop depression than soldiers who average more than 6 hours of sleep a night. If that doesn't wake you up, nothing will. Next slide. What are the cumulative effects of sleep deprivation? Well, there's a whole bunch of them right here. And I won't read them all, but we've just been through a bunch of them. Next slide. This is the data that came out of the Walter Reed Institute of Research. And I love this. I love this. And this is one that's shown a lot to the Navy flight surgeons as well. They took volunteers. These were basically Army volunteers that volunteered for the study. So they got paid full time for this. They all had a commercial driver's license. They put them through driving tests. And they used their own baseline. So you're not comparing apples and oranges. You're comparing apples to apples and oranges to oranges. So they had them come into the lab. They slept their normal amount for first couple of days, T1, T2. And then they for the next week, they restricted their sleep. Next slide. And as expected, you saw a decline in performance related to the amount of sleep deprivation you got. No surprise here. Different colors represent the hours of sleep that they got. So green was 9 hours, 7, yellow was 7, and that wasn't a whole lot of difference. But then when you got into 5 hours sleep, which is blue, or red, which is only 3 hours sleep a night, you saw a serious decline over that week in the ability to function. Here's the amazing part to this study, the next slide. There's not a lot shown on this. What was unexpected was the extended time for recovery to return back to your baseline. And those with 7 or fewer hours of sleep did progressively poor on the psychomotor vigilance test, and it took longer than 3 days to recover from their lack of sleep. Longer than 3 days. So those with less than 7 hours did not make a full recovery, even after 3 days. And now you know why sometimes after a long weekend or a vacation, you feel really, really well, because you may actually just have charged up your batteries that have been running at never higher than 70, 80% if you don't get much sleep. Next slide. Caffeine and melatonin, are they safe? Well, this is a slide, it's too confusing to look at. So I basically pulled out 2 things. I looked at caffeine and melatonin, because those are over-the-counter things that people take a lot. So basically melatonin, you just need to avoid alcohol. You can't go fly if it's within 5 hours. But if it's more than 5 hours, you're okay, because the half-life is only 50 to 60 minutes. And 4.5 lives of this means it's totally eliminated. So if you took melatonin, you shouldn't drive, shouldn't fly. But if it's been 5 or 6 hours, there's virtually none of it left in your system. Next slide. Does caffeine actually enhance performance? Next slide. Well, Walter Reed, the same people that do the study, actually make little caffeine pills, caffeine chewing gum for the military. And what you get out of this is they actually, this is where the little graph to the right is speed of function. In other words, how long it takes to react, the delay in reaction. So the purple lower line is a faster response that you get with caffeine. So it's lower milliseconds. Not only does caffeine create alertiveness, but also decreases the reaction time. So you react faster. Unfortunately, if you can see by the graph, from 7 to 10, it only lasts about 3 hours. So if you're going to take caffeine, try to time it so that it's when you really need to be alert. So yes, it does work. Next slide. What's the minimum number of hours of sleep for optimal health? What's the lucky number?
7.
Right. Now, here's something, next slide. This came out of the Walter Reed study. And what everybody should look at this slide. And if you get nothing out of this discussion today, you really should take a peek. If this doesn't get your attention during this COVID-19 panic, nothing will. Insufficient sleep blunts the immune system's ability to fight infections like COVID-19. So if you want to do one thing that's going to cut down your chances of getting COVID and surviving COVID, those who average less than 7 hours of sleep are 3 times more susceptible, and those who average less than 5 hours of sleep are 4.5 times more susceptible to the infection, to get the infection. So just remember, 7 is the lucky number for fighting off infections like COVID. Next slide. The Auxiliary Aviation Training Manual for conclusion of the lecture, I'll just go to the official guide. And they basically say this. Next slide. Certain advanced physiologic or psychological factors can be responsible for causing accidents both in the air and on the ground. These adverse events include fatigue, improper diet, blah, 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 blah. And basically it says, keep an eye on it, especially if you're the pilot in command. So next slide. How long can you live without oxygen? 4 to 10 minutes. Water, 5 to 7 days. Nutrition, 1 to 2 months. Sleep, 2 to 3 weeks. And actually, animals, people can die of a lack of sleep, and it's because their immune system fails and they get septic. So there's a requirement for sleep. You can't live without it. Next slide. And this concludes the second part of the Human Factors Aeromedical Brief on fatigue and sleep deprivation. And this picture is a picture of the Coast Guard cutter Eagle again. And it's the only tall ship active in service in the United States military. The Constitution, they tow it out once a year just to say it is, but then they tow it back, so it's not really. As a sailboat lover, I contacted the ship's executive officer a few months ago to see if there's any possible way I could actually serve as a auxiliary member aboard the Eagle in my future stay with the Coast Guard Auxiliary. And she said, there's only 2 ways. She said either as a cook or a ship's doctor. So right in 1 second, my chances got cut in half. If you ever tasted my food, that makes sense. That's the second part. You want me to keep going or any questions so far?
Bruce, talk to Dr. Perney about serving on this ship. He can help you.
I already have. And he told me I need to really get on board. I need to get operational. My secret clearance is already, the paperwork's done. It's submitted through you guys. And thank you very much, Will, for setting that up. So when I get all the ducks in order, he said I can do it. He also said that a lot of the active duty folks that work don't want to do it because they have to quarantine after they go on the ship for 2 weeks. So, but anyway, he said it's a distinct possibility, not as a cook, but as a physician. Next slide.
Bruce, we had one comment.
Yes.
That if you or anybody had gotten any advanced information about the recent F-35 accident with the C-130 tanker, whether it was what the related cause was, or maybe if it was fatigue related?
Oh, I don't know. I don't know. And I just, I saw it on the news, and I know that they're going to be all over that, especially, especially since they've had more than one of these, because they're really concerned about mechanical issues or problems. And my guess is it's a fly-by-wire plane. So if it's not a human factors issue from the pilot, then they're going to be looking at fly-by-wire communications with the throttle. So I don't know yet, and I'm sure that'll come out in the investigation. And I can make some phone calls maybe and find out, and I'll let you know if I do.
Okay, great. And that's the, got a couple,
Bruce, I have a comment.
go ahead.
I have a comment. For the fatigue area. Now, the FAA is at fault for not amending the FARs, i.e. for allowing companies to let pilots fly, i.e. Part 91, when they're fatigued.
Mm-hmm.
I have done that from experience, and it is not safe at all.
Mm-hmm.
I flew from, well, again, maybe a different time or factor, but however, I flew from Kelly, carrying ordnance to Gander,
Mm-hmm.
from Gander to Stansted, and Stansted to Dehydration, dropped off the ordnance, and flew right back again to Kelly without any crew rest. When I was going across the pond, I fell asleep and I could not keep myself awake, and the rest of the crews were about the same way also. This again is part of the FAA,
Right.
not to amend the FARs. It's their fault.
Unfortunately, a lot of times action isn't taken until there's an adverse event. And when they find an adverse event, sometimes they have to prove that it was fatigue that caused it. So the FAA obviously is looking at fatigue more than they used to. Like I said, the last article was from the FAA on fatigue, and that was just last month. But it's not going to be the carriers that do it. It's going to be the FAA that mandates a restriction.
Exactly. And when was the last time they amended the FARs for Part 91 flying? That was dated back to 1933, and it's still the same rules.
I thought they passed the rule for I don't know. I have to plead I don't know.
Because I checked it, and you know, I was subjected to that beating.
Wow.
Bruce, did you say you were looking for an update on the incident?
Yes.
Yeah, this one just came through, said that all the crews are okay.
Oh, good.
Crew members have been reported safe. The pilot of the F-35 Lightning II, that's the short takeoff vertical landing variant, ejected safely and is being treated. And all the KC-130J crew members have reported safe. They managed to perform a safe crash landing on a field near Thermal Airport, California.
Wow. So did it say what part of the structure of the tanker was hit? It had to be mid-air collision.
I think at least two of the engines lost their props.
Yeah, the right side has no props in the picture. It's a ugly scene.
Okay. Okay. Any other questions or comments before we go to the last section? Okay. Next slide. The last section is on alcohol, age, and medications. And by that, I don't mean old, hungover. Anyway, so next slide. Does a pilot's age have an effect on the risk of aviation errors and accidents? Next slide. And you know who this is, right? It's Anthony Quinn, and it's a movie made from The Old Man and the Sea, which is a book by Ernest Hemingway. And Flying SAR, you may be searching for the old man in the sea, or on a bad day, you might even become the old man in the sea. So does a pilot's age have an adverse effect on risk? Well, not necessarily. Next slide. And first of all, this slide, the study was based in Alaska, where you might encounter some of the most difficult and challenging flying in the United States. And looking at total statistics, and what you have here basically is percent of accident statistics. And they broke it down into medical certificate class, and in each class, they broke it down into 16 years old, which is the blue, 30 to 44 years old, which is the maroon. The green is 45 to 59, and then the dark blue is greater than 60. And what they found was that the first class medical certificate holders have the lowest percentage of total accidents. The second and third class medical certificate holders are about the same. The highest risk age group in all three classes was not the 60-year-old group, and it was not the less than 29 group, but it was the 45 through 59-year-old group in all three certificate classes. Next slide. Pilot errors and air carrier accidents. Does age matter? And this is from aviation, space, and environmental medicine. Accidents involving older pilots were more likely to be caused by turbulence, where accidents involving younger pilots were more likely to be taxiing events. Conclusion, the prevalence and patterns of pilot errors don't seem to change with age. The lack of association between a pilot's age and errors may be due to the safe worker effect of older pilots, resulting in rigorous selection process and certificate standards, et cetera, et cetera. So it says that age doesn't matter. And a lot of these studies came out when they were evaluating when they bumped the age of retirement in professional pilots from 60 to 65. So that's where a lot of these things came out. Next slide. Next. Okay, and again, looking at older aviators, a pilot, and the slide reads, I'm really feeling my age. I had a heart bypass, hip replaced, my eyes are bad, I'm going deaf, I got bad circulation, I can't feel my feet anymore, I get dizzy spells, I can't remember how old I am. Thank God I still got my pilot's license. So that's why the FAA mandates flight reviews and medical requirements. So you ask, okay, so much for the less than 65-year-old pilots. What about 70 and 80-year-old pilots? Next slide. Okay, so looking at fatal accidents, and this is where pilots died and they do autopsies, and these are pilots over the age of 70. Looking at 114 fatal accidents in general aviation and the pilots over 70, the autopsy data showed that 13% had 3 or more drugs in their system. And if you categorize which drugs they were first-generation antihistamines, which makes you very sleepy, and believe it or not, antidepressants. Both of these have sedating properties. So the 70-year-old pilots, drugs, amphetamines and antidepressants. Next slide. Octogenarians means 80. So general aviation accidents involving the 80-year-old airman, implications for medical evaluation. Overall fatal accident rate was actually about the same as younger pilots. I didn't expect that, but that's what it says. But those fatal accidents of the octogenarians, 80-year-olds, landing accidents were almost twice as those compared to their younger cohorts. So yeah, the 11 and 13%. So being an old pilot didn't really increase your risk of fatality. Next slide. Okay, let's look at some NTSB fatal accident statistics. The number of pilots with drugs discovered on autopsy, and those with drugs, how many of those contribute to the accident, basically. Next slide. So the NTSB looked at over 700 pilot fatalities at the time of autopsy, and the only thing you really need to look at in these abstracts are where the arrows are. At the time of autopsy, 42% of pilots had drugs in their system. But there was no correlation with the type of pilot license and the drug use. The number of drugs in their system did correlate with increased age and those with third-class medical certificates. They had the highest correlation, 54%. So you may ask, what kind of drugs did they actually find at autopsy? Keeping in mind they probably shouldn't be on some of these drugs, but they were. Prescription drugs, 29%, some of those they could have been or not been on. Control drugs, which they shouldn't be on, 15%. Over-the-counter drugs, 20%. Some of those are okay, some aren't. And opioids, which no one should be on, 5%. 25% of the drugs that they found were mentally impairing. But here's the hooker to this, okay? The NTSB concluded that in only 3.8% of the accidents, the drugs that were in the pilot systems were actually a causative factor in the accidents. So just because you have some drugs doesn't mean it had anything at all to do with an accident. So that was less than 4%. I didn't expect that, but that's what the NTSB, this is an airspace medicine and human performance. That's where this came from. Next slide. So let's look at what the FAA says on over-the-counter prescription medications. They use the term go and no-go. So go, it's okay to take it. No-go, it's not. So this is right out of the FAA, okay? And I'll be glad I know you guys put out a newsletter, and I'll be glad to send the direct link to you so you don't have to search for this. But like, I pulled this out just a couple of weeks ago, so this is kind of hot off the press. And it's off the website, faa.gov. And so what medicines can you take? So this is out of the code. Next slide. Next slide. That's from the FAA where this information is coming from. This is going back to the Coast Guard on medication effects. We're going to zoom in where that arrow is. Next slide. Okay, that's B2, medication effects. The FARs prohibit pilots from performing any duty as pilot flying or pilot non-flying while using any medication that affects the faculties in any way contrary to safety. Yeah, no brainer. The safest rule is not to fly as a pilot, aircrew, or observer while taking any medication. No brainer. Then here's the hooker, unless approved to do so by the FAA. So what drugs does the FAA say you're approved to take, and what are the stipulations? Next slide. When you look at a drug and you pick up something, now let's say over-the-counter, OTC up top means over-the-counter medications. So what can I take? Can I take Afrin? Can I take a nose spray? Can I take any? Sometimes you got to take something. Can you fly? They need you to fly. There's somebody, we need to do a SAR. Well, I'm taking some Afrin, or I took Tylenol. Can I fly or not? Well, the first thing the FAA wants you to do is pick up the label, and then all the labels look like this, and read the label. So active, you don't care about inactive ingredients. Active ingredients, what's in the drug. And then the next section says read the label. And if it says anything like may cause drowsiness, or says must be careful when driving a motor vehicle or operating machinery, i.e. an airplane's machinery, that's a no-go. And then read carefully the directions. And it's looking at the dosage interval. Is it twice a day, every 4 hours, or whatever? And there's a reason for that. So next slide. And I was surprised by a few of these, having been a Navy flight surgeon, where most of the stuff was off the counter. Antihistamines, I mean, that used to be a no-go. Well, believe it or not, they say non-sedating products, Allegra and Claritin, are a go. You can take them. This is per the FAA. And so the Coast Guard manual says, you do what the FAA says you can do. So they referred the general aviation, i.e. Coast Guard pilots, to what they say. So this is current. So you can take Allegra and you can take Claritin as an antihistamine, but you can't take, and I found this to be kind of strange, Zyrtec. They advertise themselves as being non-sedative. I found that really strange. And Zysol is another one that's on TV as being non-sedative. Now that may also be because they haven't done, they have to look at things for a year before they'll say it's safe. But sleep aids, melatonin is not an antihistamine. So we talked about melatonin before. You can't fly within 5 hours, and but if it's after 5, if you needed to go to sleep, it's okay according to the FAA. Nasal decongestion. This used to be a no-go because you could get sinus block. But they say Sudafed is okay, Afrin is okay. keep in mind, if you are using Afrin and you go fly at a high altitude, you should take the Afrin with you because you could get a eustachian tube block. And the best way to break that, if blowing your nose doesn't work, is to squirt some Afrin and then try it again. Next slide. I'm sorry, cough. Back up a little bit, or I've got it on mine. Cough. Coricidin is a go. Back down one. Sorry about that, my fault. Cough products. Coricidin is allowed if there's no chlorpheniramine. That's chlorpheniramine maleate. Guaifenesin is okay, but no dextromethorphan. That's the DM. That does make you sleepy, so that's a no-go. Next slide. Just aches and pains. Can I take Tylenol? Yeah. Aspirin? Yeah. Motrin? Yeah. Anything that's like PM or not. Just about all the lidocaine patch they even allow. Caffeine is okay. Going down to GI problems. Imodium is a no-go. I guess it's not supposed to be sedating, but it could be. So they've made that a no-go. Pepto-Bismol and KO Peptate are go. But you got to ask yourself, if I'm flying and I need to take Pepto-Bismol because I got diarrhea, you might want to stop and like look at yourself in the mirror, even if it's controlled with a little bit of KO Peptate or Pepto-Bismol. And then GI illness, Nexium, Prevacid, Prilosec, Tagamet. I thought these would be a no-go, so they're not. They're actually okay to take according to the FAA. And you're not quoting me, this is right out of the FAA. So, and I'll be glad to send Will Caskey a link to this so you can just download it if you want to double check yourself. I'll be glad to send it so you don't have to look through the FAA files for it. Next slide. Now, definite no-go medications. And a lot of these are also related to the condition itself. Angina medications, having chest pain, maybe it's the condition. Anticholinergics, atropine, benzapine. If you're taking medicines if you're being treated for cancer, that's probably a no-go. Next slide. One thing I want, diabetic medicines, that may be a go. And that you might be, people that are diabetics may be able to get a waiver for certain things. And controlled substances, don't even think about flying on narcotics. The arrow here, your doctor gives you a medicine. He says, this is great. You go home, you go, well, can I take it or not? I haven't even heard of this medicine. And you don't know, you can't figure it out. The FAA requires at least 1 year of post-marketing experience. They want everybody to be a guinea pig first with the new drug before considering it for aeromedical certification purposes. So if you don't see it, it doesn't really mean it's going to be a no-go. They just can't say they've had it long enough to be a go. And then hypertension, which is a big one, that doesn't have an arrow by it. Clonidine, nitrates, and some of these other drugs are no-goes. Next slide. Steroids, low-dose steroids like prednisone may be a go. So if you've had bad poison ivy, it says, and they search on a Medrol dose pack, it wants less than 20 milligrams of prednisone. And then it gets into dosage. In other words, how long, if you're on one of these no-go meds, when can you fly? So I'm going to show you I'm going to show you a short way of remembering it. And it talks about, next slide, which zooms into this topic. And this is all from the FAA. 5 dosage intervals before you can fly if you're on a no-go medicine. You stop a medicine, when can I go fly? Well, if it's 4 to 6 hours, you got to wait 30. If it's every 8 hours, you got to wait 40. So basically, if it's 4 to 6 or every 8 hours, you wait 2 days. If it's every 12 hours, you wait 3 days because it's 60 hours. So if it's not every 12 hours, if it's more frequent than 12 hours, you're going to wait 2 days. Otherwise, you're going to wait 3 days. And that kind of sums it all up. So, and this is on the FAA website again. Next slide. And I'm almost done, I promise. Drinking and flying, the problem of alcohol use by pilots. And when I saw that article, I thought of Denzel Washington in the movie Flight, where the hungover pilot's flying upside down. So, but this is a real problem, and alcohol. Next slide. The short version is, and that's the Coast Guard's version. Drinking and flying don't mix because thought, reaction time, and judgment are all impaired to some point. So next slide. Next slide. What are the residual effects of alcohol hours after consumption? So next slide. A few years ago, I was a captain of a 48-foot sailboat. We were sailing through the British Virgin Islands. I went down in the hold. I came back up looking for one of the crew members, and the other crew member said, "Oh, he's up changing the flag because the flag is stuck, and he's up changing the pirate's flag." The line was jammed. I look up, and he shimmied up the mast. There's no bosun's chair. He's got a knife in his mouth, and I kind of dropped my jaw because I'm the captain. I didn't know anything about it. So he goes, "Don't worry about it. I know how to do this." Next slide. Looking at the pictures when we got back from the trip, this was the day before. So sometimes it's better to be lucky than good. Any captain needs an XO to blame poor behavior on, because the old Coast Guard tradition that the beatings will continue until morale improved doesn't really work anymore. And flatting, bowing, and alcohol aren't necessarily the smartest mix. So next slide. This is where alcohol fits in causative factors. They jumped it all together with alcohol supplements, etc. And remember, you think it would be a little bit higher when we saw how high the numbers were for seniors flying. But remember, the FAA and TSB said it was only 3.8%. So that's why that isn't any higher. Next slide. Now, remember, the FAA has a blood alcohol limit of 0.04, half the limit for driving a car. So they actually did a study. Aviation, Space, Environmental Medicine actually did a study. They let pilots fly aircraft on a simulator, and they looked at their performance when it got below 0.04%. And they found out that most pilots actually did okay at that level. But under really heavy workload conditions, they had some issues. But when they asked the pilots, 75% of them reported the physical or mental effects they could feel due to alcohol. So they were probably working on the Peter principle. Next slide. Now the next slide is the same information you saw before, but smashed together, those two slides. And what it does is, if you look on the left, that's the relative performance. And that blue line in there is when it starts to go below your baseline. And then where you can see where the performance dips, and then it comes back up. The 0.04 is where the performance level, that's why the FAA used that number, 0.04 blood alcohol content, because they said people did okay unless they were greater than that. And 0.08 down here is legally drunk. So you can see where it's not a good idea to fly. And you can also see at the bottom, they also laid it on top of hours of wakefulness. So you can see when you're past, actually this shows more like 15 hours, it starts to degrade. They use 17 in the article. Next slide. Here we go. So your observer or your air crew has a couple of drinks. You don't, but they do. This study right here, the influence of alcohol and aging on radio communications during flight. They looked at younger pilots and older pilots. They call mean age 42, and they flew aircraft simulators. And they found out the performance was impaired 2 hours after reaching 0.1, and it was just as bad for 8 hours after reaching 0.1. So there's an 8-hour hangover after pilots. That may be where the old 8 hours from bottle to throttle came from, but this also impaired communication. Next slide. Now I'm almost done. Does aging change the threshold sensitivity to dehydration? Right. So the young guy sitting next to you has a swig. You say, "I'll have a swig. I'm really good." No. Next slide. The aging process alters a physiological control mechanism of thirst in society, satiation. In other words, diminished sensation to thirst and overhydration confirms what we thought earlier. If you just have a little bit of fluid, you actually inactivate that mechanism that inside you, baroreceptors and your physiologic mechanism that says, I need more water. So you fool your body into thinking you've got enough water by just a small sip. So if you're going to drink enough to make a difference. And it probably should be like half a liter, looking at some other studies. Next slide. I'm going to just go through these real quick. Elderly subjects showed deficits in sensing reduced extracellular volume through reduced low high pressure baroreceptors. Medically, that means that if you're a little older, you don't have the same vascular feedback to your brain saying, I need to drink fluid. And that also, other thing that does that is alcohol. But alcohol affects dehydration because it can cause that. Next slide. What does the Coast Guard say? Next slide. Coast Guard says we don't care about 0.04 FAA. We don't care about the Driver's License Bureau with the 0.08. We have a zero alcohol tolerance, and it's essential for all aviation personnel to meet the demands of flight operations. Aviation personnel are restricted from aerial flight for 12 hours after the last alcohol use and must have no residual effects. This includes the use of low and no alcohol beer. Residual effects include lightheadedness, headache, fatigue, nausea, and lack of alertness. And so the restriction applies to all flight crew, not just the pilot. So that's the Coast Guard Auxiliary's formal statement. Next slide. So in conclusion, I want to thank you guys for your attendance. I know it's been a long talk. And I hope that the review of the human factors was informative and even a little bit entertaining. I learned a lot from researching these topics and even changed my mind on a few preconceived concepts. One of my professors in medical school said to me, no matter how old you are, even if retired, never stop learning. Even if you do, you're dead. And this guy obtained a medical degree at 28, his second residency at 35, and he got his black belt in karate at 82. So, next slide. So, this is, and in conclusion, this concludes this year's Aeromedical Brief on Human Factors. Fly safe, have fun, keep learning, save lives, and always remain semper paratus. And I'll be glad to stick around and answer any questions or comments if anyone has any. And hope that's
Bruce, this is Will. I was watching some of the questions come in the chat room.
Yes.
And there was kind of a central theme to some of them. Were there any significant differences on all these things between males and females? And then also kind of a variation on that question about your body mass index.
I don't have the chat room up here, but it did not, the studies I saw did not look at male versus female at all. And they lumped them all together. So there was no sub-delineation of sex. And I did not look at body mass index to see if that was related. I didn't put that as one of the categories. So since I didn't look, I don't know.
Okay.
So increased body mass index affects heat tolerance, but as far as alcohol and aging and drugs and medicine, I don't know.
Right. Okay. Any other questions from the audience?
Yeah, there was the one about the COVID vaccine.
Not done yet.
The COVID vaccine, whether or not that's approved or not?
I don't know. My guess is no, but that's a separate talk on COVID.
Is it a no for 12 months, or is it a no when the vaccine comes out? We can't take it until it's out for 12 months. It's just what the FAA says.
My guess, you're asking me to guess because I can't read the mind of the CDC or the FDA. My guess is it's first going to go to healthcare providers and the high-risk groups such as nursing homes and people in the hospital. And it'll go to the military and police. Then it'll go to the public. That would be my guess. And there are multiple companies with vaccines right now, and some of them are close to finishing stage 3 trials. And I don't think they really want to push it. The Russians were passing stage, they're trying to release it in stage 2, and I would guard against that if I were you. I don't have a date, and I haven't heard anything about a date yet.
And Bruce, I think what he means is when it's approved, how long will, usually for most vaccines in the military, you have to wait 24 or 48 hours before you can fly, just in case.
Oh, yeah,
Same thing.
yeah. It's going to be probably the same thing. And if it's a live attenuated, they may want to make it more like 72. If it's not a live attenuated, it may be, because all you're doing with other ones is just trying to stimulate your immune response. But if it's a live virus they're giving you, I don't know. Then it's going to be a little bit longer.
And right now, I think a lot of the vaccine trials are finding people complaining about headaches and fatigue. So we'll have to wait, first of all, that they actually get one that they think is safe and effective,
Right.
and get side effects. And like anything else, you're going to have to probably wait at least 24 hours just in case you have the 1 in a million that has a bad reaction, or you have even a localized reaction, a fever, chill, or swelling or pain in your arm.
Yeah, and headache, fatigue, loss of taste and smell are also part of any virus, flu virus and corona. So those are also symptoms of having a virus or an influenza virus or corona.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I just heard the FAA will not allow you to take the vaccine because it's not proven out, and they don't know what the adverse effects are going to be of the vaccine itself. So they're going to give all these pilots are going to get vaccines, and they have no idea what this is going to do, 6 months from now.
Well,
I think that means don't sign up for for the trial. If
yeah.
you're volunteering for the vaccine trials, then so you don't have any potential problems down the road flying. Don't take it. I said a lot of people are complaining about headaches and fatigue. So if you are in a vaccine trial and you do develop side effects like that, then you're probably going to end up finding yourself having to ground yourself anyhow.
And again, that's a completely different topic that I really wasn't kind of hoping not to get into. I can tell you a couple of simple things. One, you just learned in this lecture that having at least 7 hours of sleep a night cuts your chances of getting COVID. And if you get COVID, it cuts the chances of ending up in a hospital if you have adequate sleep. Another thing they looked at was in Italy. These are simple things. They found out that you double the risk of being hospitalized with severe COVID if you're vitamin D deficient. They actually checked what vitamin D levels in Italy. And you think in Italy with all the sun, it wouldn't be an issue, but vitamin D is cheap. And if it doesn't mean that you take it, you won't, but it means if you are deficient, you're going to decrease your chances. And another drug is selenium. It's a mineral, trace mineral. The Chinese looked at people that had selenium in different areas, and they found out those that had selenium deficiency had a much higher fatality rate with COVID. So both of these are cheap over the counter, and they probably won't hurt you. The only thing about selenium is if you have a mild prostate cancer, it may make it a little bit more aggressive. So, and you don't know, that's one of the risks of selenium. But Fauci takes vitamin D, if that means anything, if you're a Fauci fan or not. But he takes vitamin D and vitamin C. He admitted to it. So that's a freebie that I would definitely do to decrease your chances. And I have friends that have gotten it, and the things that they told me is most of them are fatigued, most of them are tired, and most of them are really annoyed with the taste of the loss of taste and smell. And most of them have gotten back on their feet, but it takes a few months.
Bruce, I'm going to jump in for a second and let people know that the slide deck has been posted in the chat room. If anybody wants to pull that down, you ought to be able to find it and somehow click on it and grab
Any
it.
comments or for the lecture, or too long, too short, or what? Any comments for the next time?
Thought it was excellent.
Oh, thank you. Okay, so very good.
Bruce, thank you again so much. One of the best presentations we've seen in years. So can really tell you put a lot of time and effort into it, and thank you. So With no further questions, Walter, you can turn the recording off. And as a reminder, we're going to do a 70-30 for the entire workshop, so you don't need to do this individually. And thank you very much for your attendance. Good night.
And if anybody was not able to record in the chat room, just shoot me an email. It's auxwar@gmail, and we'll get you credit for this.
Well, thanks, everybody.
Bruce, thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Good night.
Thank
you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Good night.
Good night.
Good night.
Thank you. Good night.